Chapter 5. Ms. Alexander's Krav Maga. Monday, November 2nd, 1981. Velia fished the crusty gunk out of her eyes as she wandered into the kitchen. On the counter was a neatly folded note adorned with her name in ballpoint ink calligraphy surrounded by tiny hearts. Bertie, I'm sorry for losing my temper last night. I let the stress of the situation affect how I spoke to you, and that was wrong. I want to talk about it and your job over dinner tonight. Love, Mom. Velia dressed for school and headed out to the curb. She dreaded her bus ride each day because for 13 grueling minutes, she was trapped with Roger. The smell of faux leather and adolescent sweat whirled into her face as she climbed the narrow stairs and into the school bus. Roger was sitting in the back, surrounded by a gaggle of supplicants who snickered at Velia. She found an empty row of seats at the front and slid into one. She was taking a deep breath, hoping the worst was behind her, when something slimy struck the back of her head and dripped onto her shoulders. Velia scooped a handful of the viscous vanilla-scented substance from the curls of her hair. A half-opened Jell-O pudding snack container now occupied the adjacent seat. Driven by rage, Velia shot up and faced the raucous laughter that erupted throughout the bus. Roger couldn't have been smiling wider. She was ready to rush down the aisle toward her nemesis, but the bus driver intervened. "Sit down, young lady, right now!" Roger contorted his face to bait Velia, but a large bump in the road threw her forward and into the back of her seat, causing her nose to bleed. The humiliation was mounting exponentially. And they hadn't even arrived at school, she thought, using the sleeve of her jacket to catch the blood spilling from her face. The rest of the ride was much the same. Objects were thrown in her direction, but none met their mark. Though she sat with her pudding-soaked shoulders held high, inside her emotions were in flux. Shame turned to anger, then to sadness, and finally to acceptance. Being near the door allowed Velia to run into the school before Roger and the others could catch up. She headed straight to the bathroom. The sight of her bloodied face was motivation for the other girls to turn around and flee. Velia removed her jacket and soaked the sleeve in a sink while pulling speckled white gelatin from her hair. This proved untenable, so she submerged parts of her head under the faucet of another sink. Using a handful of rough brown paper towels, she caught the soiled water dripping from her scalp. Staring into her own eyes, Velia dug deep for courage to face the rest of her day, but broke down and pounded on the stone countertop. She took a breath, rubbed the blood from her face before wringing the similarly colored ichor from her jacket sleeve, and walked to class. Ms. Alexander ran a tight ship, and even Roger didn't dare step out of line in her presence. This provided a much-needed respite to the start of what promised to be a long week for Velia. But when the lunch bell sounded, Velia knew she'd be left to her own defenses, and fear kept her glued to her seat. "Aren't you hungry?" Patricia asked from the rostrum at the front of their classroom. Her dark hair fell neatly on either side of her head, framing out her perfectly plucked eyebrows and immaculate smile. "No," Velia answered. "Can I wait here?" "Sure, but you'll have to tell me what's really going on." "It's Roger." Ms. Alexander nodded. "I'm sorry, dear. There have been many complaints against him, but they don't lead to anything," Velia fumed. "Right. His father gives a lot of money to the school, money that's desperately needed and does good, so the administration looks the other way, I know. Basically." Patricia closed the distance, sitting at the desk to Velia's right. "Can I give you some off-the-record advice?" "Sure." "You have two options. You can ignore him and hope he moves on to someone else when he fails to get a reaction out of you. Or," Velia preempted, "or you can stand up to him. But if you try that tactic, you better be confident you can win, or it'll only empower him." "He's twice my size," Velia moaned. "That doesn't always matter. Do you know any self-defense?" "No." "Have you asked your boss? He spent a lot of time training with a man from Los Angeles in a new form of self-defense called Krav Maga. You should ask him to show you some moves. They're intuitive, and they level the playing field." Velia's eyes lit up. "What do you mean?" "Let's just say that people, particularly boys, have specific soft spots. If you learn to attack those, Their bigger size doesn't matter. How do you know this? About Kevin? Patricia broke eye contact. He does private lessons with me. Mostly on the weekends, nothing formal, just as it's needed. Velia leaned toward her teacher. Can I ask you something? Patricia sat upright, pawing at her skirt like she was ironing the fabric with her hands. Of course. What would you like to know? Can I leave? Class? Yes, Velia confirmed. Right now? Yes. Where will you go? Miss Alexander asked. To see Kevin. He'll already be at work. He could teach me this afternoon, before Roger and his locusts descend on the arcade. How will you get there? I'll walk. I've done it before. I don't know, Patricia said, stroking at her skirt. If something happens and they find out I covered for you, please, Patricia. Miss Alexander frowned at Velia. You'll be careful? Thank you, Velia exclaimed, jumping from her seat. Tell Kevin to call the school and ask for me when you get there. I want to know you made it safely. If you get picked up by a truancy officer, I'll have to deny any involvement. You're the best! Velia hugged her and snuck out the side door. What are you doing here? Kevin inspected his Casio calculator wristwatch. It was one of his most prized possessions. I need your help, Velia replied. Anything, just name it. Can you teach me self-defense? Also, I need you to... Velia was cut short by the chime of the front door. A broad-shouldered man wearing a 10-gallon hat entered the Malibu Grand Prix. Afternoon, folks. How can I help you? Kevin grinned. I was in the parking lot and noticed this young lady entering the arcade. The man glanced at Velia from behind his thick glasses. He had a jet-black gunslinger mustache, an out-of-place wardrobe, and looked to be in his late 60s. Do you make it a habit to watch children? Kevin challenged. Sorry about that. The man fished through his pocket and brandished a truancy officer badge. Name's Kincaid. Dr. Kincaid. We've had reports of kids skipping school to frequent these types of establishments. I wanted to talk with this little girl. Velia winced from the man's choice of words. They have PhDs chasing kids now? Kevin ran interference. She's my daughter and wasn't feeling well this morning. I left her at home but got nervous and called her in so I could keep a closer eye on the symptoms. Is that true? The officer glared at Velia. She coughed into her hand a few times to sell their grift. Yep, and she's the only child in here right now. Sorry to waste your time, Mr. Kincaid, Kevin said, making air quotes with his fingers. We've got a senior citizen discount for our go-karts, if you're interested. The officer tipped his hat and returned to the parking lot. Thanks, Velia said with a smile. No problem. He strikes me as the type of law enforcer who'd leave a dead possum at the burger barn. Where were we? I need you to call Mountain View Middle School and let Ms. Alexander know that I made it. Kevin's face glowed as he picked up the orange creamsicle-colored phone. After sending the analog smoke signal, he took Velia to the back office and introduced her to the fundamentals of a fighting stance and basic combative strikes. Why the sudden interest in self-defense? Velia panted. I'm tired of being pushed around. Did something happen? Though Roger was her real concern, she deflected. I think a guy tried to grab me yesterday on my walk home. What? Kevin dropped his arms to his side. He offered me a ride, but I got a bad vibe and ran. I'm tired of doing that. Running away, I hate it. Kevin moved closer to Velia. Running is the best strategy. But if you ever find yourself in a situation where that's not possible, you need to act viciously. A strike to the groin is your best bet, Kevin said, demonstrating how to complete a solid front kick. Velia's smile widened at the practicality of the advice. If a groin strike fails and you get wrapped up in the attacker's arms, it doesn't take much to gouge out an eye with your thumb. Her jaw dropped at the brutality of Kevin's caveat. Her boss rechecked his wristwatch. The afternoon crowd will arrive soon. We can keep training during breaks in your shifts. Speaking of, we're short today. Want to work while you're here? Sure thing, boss, Velia answered. The first kid to walk through the arcade's door was Roger. It wasn't surprising. He was the only one with deep enough pockets to spend afternoons burning quarters. Velia maintained her distance, so he didn't notice her. Like all the other kids, he was captivated by Polybius. A slow trickle of children followed, all congregating around Roger. Velya's curiosity climbed, and she crept toward the crowd. After strategically repositioning, she got her first clear view of the game. It had a single joystick and a symmetrical array of action buttons on either side. The game was tubular in the literal sense of the word, since the single player navigated a small craft around obstacles in a psychedelic-colored environment. Half the time this happened inside the tube, but without warning the gameplay would invert and the high-speed craft would appear outside of the pipeline. In both cases, unavoidable objects could be pulverized into a cloud of geometric-shaped stardust by triggering the craft's various cannons via the action buttons. All of this was set against a stellar backdrop, giving Polybius a futuristic and space-like feel. The movement was so frantic that it gave Velya a headache, but she couldn't look away because the graphics were light years ahead of anything else in the arcade. She understood why everyone was gravitating towards it. After a few minutes of observing Roger trying and failing to make progress, Velya noticed an important pattern. Gates resembling a pair of vertically aligned devil horns acted as checkpoints, and flying the craft through them helped safeguard against utter destruction. Roger's lack of discernment got the best of him, and he started slamming the arcade screen like the petulant child he was. "Cut it out!" Velya shouted. She'd be the one to repair any damage. Roger turned to face her with a frown. "Hey, fallopian tube. I was praying you got kidnapped at lunch." Most of the kids laughed at his comment, but Velya stood firm. Roger moved through the crowd, as if he was going to get physical, but instead he handed her a quarter. "Put your mouth where my money is. Let's see you try to beat my score." "I've never played this game," she scoffed. "It's never a fair fight when I'm involved," Roger growled. He towered a 1.5 feet over her as they stood toe-to-toe. Kevin watched cautiously from the register. "Let's bet on it, then. A final face-off, on Friday the 13th, to prove who the better player is," Roger offered. "That gives you 2 weeks to prepare. But if I win, you'll shave your head, and I get to keep the hair." He sniffed the air above her scalp. "What if I win?" Velya countered. Roger pulled a silver money clip from his pocket and started counting the bills. It was more cash than Velya had ever seen. "No," she cut him down. "I don't want money. If I win, you'll shave your head and your pubes and glue it all to your face." The crowd of kids oohed and awed with juvenile delight. "Deal," Roger huffed, pushing Velya out of the way before returning to his position monopolizing Polybius.